G'day guys, today I'm going to be showing you a once yearly winch maintenance guide. Basically we're going to strip the winch entirely apart. I'm going to show you how to service each of the components individually. So basically you want to go about this at least once a year, depending on how much you use your winch. If you use your winch more often, obviously you'll have to do this more often. Now, contrary to popular belief, a good winch is a winch that's actually being used as much as possible while being maintained. So on the other hand, if you've used your winch once and then you've never maintained it, or if you've left it for several months or up to a year, you might find that the winch isn't working to its true potential. So this is your once yearly winch maintenance guide. It'll only take you about a couple of hours at best on a lazy afternoon, and you'll only need some basic hand tools and a couple of bits and pieces to clean it all up. So as you can see, we've got the Dominator X winch here. It's absolutely legendary, and I'm sure most of you guys definitely have heard of it. This is the winch that belongs on the front of our silver D-Max, and it's been on the front of the D-Max for about 2 or 3 years now. So as you can imagine, it's had a pretty hard life, but we have kept up with the maintenance, so it's still completely operational. And yeah, let's get into it. So up this end here, we've got the electric motor, and at this end, we've got the planetary gearbox. Now, both of these ends need separate styles of maintenance, but I'm going to show you each one and show you how to go about it correctly. Basically, we need to take the motor off first, followed by the winch drum, and then we can separate the gearbox later on. So with the Dominator X, you'll need a 4mm and a 6mm Allen key. And just look for these bolts, they're all pretty obvious on most winches. Okay, so now that we've got the motor separated from the gearbox, we're actually going to pull apart the motor housing. To do that, we're going to need a 3mm Allen key and undo these small bolts that you see along the edges here. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the motor out of the housing. We're just going to hit that with either some wet and dry sandpaper, or in my case, I'm using some steel wool. You'll also notice in here, all these contacts, we're also going to give them a quick clean with contact cleaner, and the same thing with the steel wool. We're also going to grab a rag and wipe out all of this grease here and get rid of all the old grease, and then we're going to re-grease it. Now this is also a part where you might choose to put on some rubber gloves of some sort. I normally like to use the black nitrile gloves. You can get them at the local hardware store or even your local Woolies. Mine was out, so I'm using these ones, but they just work the same, so. Okay, so now that we've done the motor, we're going to open up the back end of the winch here and clean up the brushes as well, using the same technique that we just did. Okay, so when you take this end cap off, you'll have to be careful because there's a rubber seal in here, as you can see. Sometimes it can fall out, but in my case, it's all good. Okay, so now it's time to start reassembling the motor, but before we do, just go ahead and check that these springs here are all operational. You can just give these brushes here a quick little test. They're all functional, so that's all good. Now we're just going to have to grab this end of the motor, stand it upright. Now we're going to slowly and carefully slide this over the top. And you'll see that bearing sit on the brushes there. It helps if you've got a mate handy, but if not, you're just going to have to figure out how to get all of them separated to make that bearing sit in between them perfectly, like so. Okay, so before we go ahead and put this end cap back on, you'll notice a little bit of corrosion here, which is again, totally normal. This winch gets absolutely flogged on every single trip we do. We're just gonna give these two faces here a nice little cleanup. Make sure you take this seal here off. You can go ahead and replace this if you want to. Mine's in pretty good condition, so I'm just gonna leave it the way it is. And yeah, put it all back together. Okay, so when it comes time to put the end cap back on, do not forget the O-ring and this little tension washer or spring washer here. And the rest of the body goes straight on over the top. Don't worry too much about lining up the bolt holes just yet, because we can always do that later on. Sweet, we're all good. So now we're just got to line up these bolt holes. So we'll start threading these in. Okay, so the end cap's back on, nice and secure. Now I'm going to flip it over. We're going to put these bolts back into place here. Also worth noting which way these terminals are on your winch before you start pulling it apart. In my case, it doesn't really matter just because of how I've got it mounted on the bull bar of the D-Max. But if you want them in the same spot, just make sure you take note before you start pulling things apart. As I said, guys, it's worth investing in some heavy duty gloves. As you can see, these ones are pretty weak. The black ones tend to be way better. Okay, sweet, so that's the motor end done. We're going to set that to the side and we're going to move on to the gearbox now. So, now it's time to move on to the gearbox. We've got a little bit of corrosion around the bolt holes here, which is totally normal again, but the most important part is there's no water ingress inside the gearbox, like we can see. It all looks beautiful. So we're going to go ahead and pull it apart anyway. Now this grease in here is what actually keeps the winch in tip-top condition. It keeps water out, it helps the gear spin freely, really nice. So it's super important that we get rid of all the old grease and pack new grease in there, because you don't want old grease mixing with new grease. Before we go ahead and lift this part of the winch off the gearbox housing, make sure you take note of where the clutch release is in relation to how it's going to bolt up to your bull bar or the winch cradle that you've got on your car. In my case, it's real easy, this side and this side. So go ahead and lift this off real careful. See that O-ring there? All looks good to me. Just set that to the side for the moment. Okay, so we're now going to start taking apart the planetary gears. Before we do, just grab a plastic tub. Okay, so it's super important when you're pulling these apart to keep note of which one goes where. I'm just going to line them up from left to right here. Next one out, so, and the final one here. Okay, sweet, so now that we've got them all apart, you can see the grease is in really good condition. The gears all look really nice. There's no chips on them or anything like that. Give everything a good once over, make sure there's no faults in how they work at all. They all look beautiful. Okay, sweet. So now's the time we're going to get rid of all of this old grease. You can use brake cleaner, but I'm using some heavy duty degreaser here. Just make sure you give it a good soaking. You can even leave them sit here for a couple of hours. And just make sure you get all of the old grease off, as I mentioned earlier, because we don't want to be mixing two different types of grease together. So give them a really nice solid spray and leave them to sit there and soak for a little while. So we're also going to give the inside of the housing here a good coating as well. Get rid of all that old grease. Again guys, be generous with the degreaser. You'll notice after a few minutes it starts to work properly and you'll see all the grease just slowly fall off. It's really good if you leave it to sit for a couple of hours if you've got a whole weekend to spare. If not, half an hour to an hour should be just fine. Okay, so we're also going to pull apart the winch drum. You'll see the drive shaft sticking out here. We're going to pull that out and put some new grease on that too. You'll see there's a little tension bolt on either side here of the winch drum. Just going to have to loosen those off and then take the whole drive shaft out of the center. There you go. Now before we go ahead and start degreasing this, just have a quick look and make sure this isn't lost any of its straightness. Just make sure it's all in good nick. Looks pretty good to me. Give it a quick wipe down. That one really Don't really want too much grease on the drive shaft itself. Set that to the side and start rinsing this thing off. Grab the dirty rag again and get rid of all that grease that's sitting around the edges here. So that's all good. Okay, so once you've got all the visible grease off that you can see here, we're just gonna go ahead and let it sit for at least half an hour. I'm actually gonna let it sit for 2 hours, and we'll come back. And by the time we come back, all the grease should be stripped, but we're gonna give it a quick wipe over with a rag, and then start putting it back together with brand new grease. Okay guys, so it's been sitting for about an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours, and it's all looking good. As you can see, the degrease has done an awesome job. The main thing that we've got to get across here is that you do not want any cross contaminants, as I mentioned earlier. No mixing greases, and also when it comes time to put things back together and re-grease it, we want to get rid of all the old degreaser. So also got new gloves, as you can see as well. So we're going to go ahead and dry off all this degreaser. Thank you. And we'll get stuck into it. Some of the grease will still stay in these teeth here, but again, it's super important to make sure you get all of it out. Just use an old rag or even an old toothbrush can be handy for this sort of thing. Now, if you were curious on how the clutch on the housing of the winch here works, or the free spool function, it's pretty simple. You'll see in there when you go to the engage point, you'll see that little pin there comes out, which sits inside of this groove here. So as you pull it back the other way, that means your free spool, which allows this part to spin freely, like so. When you want it to stop, push it the other way, clicks into place and you can't move it. Okay, so now for the fun part, and definitely the most messy part of this entire job. Do not be doing this job in your Sunday best, or if you've got a date later that night, because it is ridiculously messy. Now we're just going to use some moldage grease here, and we're going to pack these gears here full of it. We're not going to go too crazy. We want a fair amount in there, but we also don't want to jam them up too much. So put a generous amount, but also be wary that you want the gears to still be able to spin freely within the gearbox. So, just pack it in, and make sure you spin the gears around as you pack it in, like so. Make sure you get every gear as well. And this stuff does stink, so again, don't be wearing any nice clothes. And gloves are a must. We get into the middle bits here as well, guys. And don't freak out if the greases are two different colors. It doesn't really matter as long as you get all the old stuff out before you start putting this new stuff in. Now when you think you're just about done, give each gear a nice little spin here. You can see it spins relatively freely, and that's exactly what we're after. And before we start putting it back together, I'm also going to give the teeth on the inside of the housing here a nice quick little coat over. Make sure we're covering all of our bases. Okay, and again, make sure we get all these internal teeth as well. Just a thin layer on these ones, guys. You don't need to go too crazy with this part. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Okay, and again, that's the part that's part of the clutch that stops the free spool action. And the edge that's closest to the bottom here, that's going to go face down this way. Just make sure that's in. Should slide in. Just make sure it works by locking that into place. And you'll see, oh, I've already done it. Yep. that will click into place like so. Okay, so if you're not sure how much grease to put in, about that much. That should be perfect. Make sure you get a nice little glob in between here, because as the gears spin, it'll just keep feeding itself through. Slide this in. So as you can see, that's in place now, and if I turn it, you can see closely, all the grease is working really, really nice. This is exactly what we want. Let's move on to the next one again. Okay, so once again, this one will slide nicely in there like so. So satisfying. So this one goes in there. Followed by this sucker. Followed by this sucker. Okay, so we've got the gearbox back together, it's all sweet. Now we're just going to put the drive shaft back into the winch drum like so. So remember, this end here with the teeth is the end that goes on the gearbox, and so that part there of the shaft goes straight down into the gearbox like that. And this is obviously the end that goes onto the motor itself. I'm just going to tighten up these grub screws just till they're flush. To make life easy, I'm just going to take this seal off, place it nicely, line up all the bolt holes here. Okay, so now we're going to mate this part up with the gearbox housing itself. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to note which way you want your clutch release. In my case, it's just straight up and down like this, but if you want to change the way it is, depending on how your bull bar is, you can go ahead and do that now. You can mount this basically any way you want to make it easy to get to. So, just going to lower it down slowly like that, line up all the holes. All sweet. We can go around, just put these in, finger tight, and once we go to tighten them, we're going to do them up in a star pattern as if you were putting a wheel back on the car. And because these are really fine thread going into an alloy housing, make sure you don't cross thread them because it's quite easy to do on this type of thing. Okay, so before we put the winch drum back on, we're just going to get a nice thin layer of grease around the inside of this seal here. I'm going to do both sides actually, just to make sure it sticks nicely. Like so. Just make sure that's seated nicely on there, and again, another nice thin layer of grease on top. Now this grease is actually going to work with the seal to keep the winch completely watertight. So this part here, you're going to have to line it up with the very bottom of inside the gearbox. It can be a little bit tricky, but once you've done it once, it should go in relatively easily. If it doesn't find itself straight away, just get the top here, wiggle it around. There we go. Sweet, so that's on there nicely. Okay, so I'm just going to lay it down like so. Okay, same thing on this side with this seal. We're almost there. Nice layer across here. Nicely around there. Make sure that's seated. Again guys, you don't need a heap of grease on this, but a little bit won't go astray. Okay, so the final step is to stand the gearbox end up like so. And you'll see a nice little groove there, which is where the part of the drive shaft from the motor itself is going to sit. So we're just going to have to try and line that up as best as we can. Stand this up. And again, that grease actually helps stick it to the housing itself, so it's nice and secure while we line this up. Beautiful, first go. I don't think that's ever happened before. No, it wasn't first go. Just going to spin that around. And we are all good. Sweet. So now we can start putting these back in. There you go guys, nice and simple, and that's how you keep your winch in tip-top condition. Again, do this every 6 to 12 months depending on how much you use it. If you're using it every single weekend in its tough bog holes or up steep gnarly tracks, then go ahead and do this more often. Now if you want to see how to use the winch to its true potential, go ahead and click in the top right hand corner.